One, we have a side event here, and I think everyone here is for that purpose. So if you could come to the front, it'll be nicer because I see like a whole group of empty chairs in front of me. So if you could move forward, those who are here, it might be nicer. Thank you. Great, thanks. Okay. Probably this one. We have a problem with him coming. And you live cast the side event? Yeah, she's responsible. Yeah, you're live casting the side event? What's the link? Like webcasting and is that happening or is just yes? Oh. Broadcast is okay. So how do we get to that? Link. Yeah, the link. So you make adaptation releases. Can you just write it on YouTube channel, you will find the video. It's on YouTube. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So when I'm doing that, then I can share it. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So do we have all our speakers? I can see one outside. So Dr. Jayathan, if you could come. Yes. Okay. So good evening again, everyone. Um, I know everyone is having all sorts of sessions going on, but we appreciate the fact that you're all here. So we are having a joint side event with the Sri Lankan government and Centro Humboldt. Yes, please, panelists. And the Southern Voices on Adaptation program. We have 4 speakers, 2 from the Sri Lankan government and 2 representing Southern Voices. And I'm Wasita Vijayanayaka, and I'm part of the Sri Lankan delegation as well as Southern Voices on Adaptation. So kind of merge both together in this side event. So Dr. Jayatung, if you could come. Our first presenter is Dr. Sunima Jayatunga. He is the director of the Climate Change Secretariat for Ministry of Mahaweli Development and Environment in Sri Lanka. And he is going to speak on climate adaptation in Sri Lanka and focus on the National Adaptation Plan of Sri Lanka as well as local and national level actions that have happened in Sri Lanka. So, yes, the flow is slide is up.
Uh, Thank you, and good afternoon to all, Madam Moderator and distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me also to welcome all of you to this side event, which is organized by the Ministry of Mahaweli Development and Environment in Sri Lanka, the government of Sri Lanka, and together with Southern Voices and Centro Humboldt from Nicaragua. Yeah, correct? Uh, Welcome all of you on behalf of these 3 organizations. Also, I take this opportunity to thank for the partnership made with us to the Southern Voices and also to the Centro Humboldt from Nicaragua. I just want to share with you that Sri Lanka, being a tropical island in the Indian Ocean, it is highly vulnerable to adverse effects of climate change, especially such as longer droughts periods due to monsoon pattern change, and also flash floods in the lowland areas, and also landslide in the central highlands due to intensive rainfalls, and also though it is low onset events, sea level rise impacts are already evidence in Sri Lanka, and also temperature changes or the temperature rise that is also influence to our especially for agriculture and other crops. Considering this vulnerability, Sri Lanka has already developed our national climate change policy addressing that adaptation needs, and also national adaptation strategy. We developed it in 2010 through a wider vulnerable assessment conducted in 2010. And based on these two documents, together with technical need assessment we conducted for 5 adaptation sectors in 2012, um, we prepared national, we start the national, preparing the national adaptation plans with referring to the COP19 decision that to provide financial supports for non-LDC countries, for other developing countries to uh, prepare and implement national adaptation plans following those COP decisions and based on the vulnerable assessment and also the technical need assessment we conducted, we prepared the national adaptation plan. We completed last year and we were able to launch this national adaptation plan last month, where the fifth Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum held in Colombo, together with Sri Lanka Next Blue Green Era program. So let me little explain little about this Sri Lanka Next Blue Green Era program. The the Sri Lanka Next Blue Green Era program we launched on 6th January of this year, especially after endorsing the Paris Agreement in last December in Paris, especially in order to implement Paris Agreement and also, as we know that, to implement sustainable development goals, especially through low carbon development pathway. So adaptation to adverse impact of climate change has been included to this Sri Lankanese Blue-Green Era program. So that blue-green means, as we know that there is blue economy and green economy. We know that we are discussing in the global forums. So what we decided to combine this blue and green economy together, because we know that, you know that Sri Lanka has 6 times sea area compared to land area. So we have a bigger area of oceans. There are a lot of ocean resources available. So combining these terrestrial resources and the ocean resources in a sustainable manner to implement in coming years. So establish this Sri Lankanese Blue-Green Era program. This was launched by His Excellency the President of Sri Lanka. So there is an highest political will. Further, I wish to share with you that national adaptation needs has been incorporated to Sri Lanka's NDCs. So we have prepared Sri Lanka NDCs considering 4 major areas. One is mitigation. There are 5 major sectors, and under adaptation related NDCs, there are 8 sectors, and also a means of implementation we have incorporated to our NDCs as one of major component, because to implement mitigation options as well as adaptation measures, so we need finance, capacity building, and technology development and transfer. And also we incorporated the loss and damage. So I am not going to discuss in detail those things, but what I want to highlight here that So adaptation NDCs of Sri Lanka comprises, as I mentioned, 8 sectors. Mainly, I just give you the food security covering agriculture, livestock and fisheries, and also the human health. Health is also one of major sector impact due to climate change impacts, and also water and irrigation, and coastal and marine, and also biodiversity and ecosystems, urban infrastructure, tourism and recreation. Those sectors have been incorporated into uh, national uh, national determined contributions of Sri Lanka in terms of adaptation. Just what I want to stress here, that uh, almost all these vulnerable sectors to adverse effect of climate change have been incorporated to our NAP, National Adaptation Plan of Sri Lanka. So I am not going to detail because Professor Buddhi Marme will present you in detail about our NAP. Yes, sir. And finally, let me inform you that our NAP, National Adaptation Plan of Sri Lanka, we formulated, or already we have forwarded to the UNFCCC, and now it is available in the NAP Central of the website of UNFCCC. So I invite you to look at it, and even you can make it your comment. We are welcome, because we are going to start that NAP implementation process very soon with the support of Green Climate Fund. We have requested funds from the Green Climate Funds. So we expect to implement it very soon in coming future. This is what I have to share with you at the moment, but in details we can discuss whatever you want to know from our NAP preparation process. So having said that, I thank you very much for your attention for my brief intervention. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jayatunga. I'll take questions for Dr. Jayatunga and Professor Marabe together. That way it's interlinked after Professor Marabe's presentation. So Professor Marabe is the next speaker, Buddhi Marabe, and he's also the chair for the Expert Committee on Adaptation in Sri Lanka, and he'll be presenting on the National Adaptation Plan and how it was developed, as well as how we're going to implement it, I believe.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Vasta, for the general introduction. And Dr. Jayatunga, other distinguished guests here at the head table, ladies and gentlemen. I will take you through a quick go-through about the National Adaptation Plan, the process that we followed, and also talk to you about the involvement of people, involvement of different strata of Sri Lanka people, as well as the future plans that we have with respect to its implementation, also bringing up certain issues that are in front of us that we have to solve before start implementing the program. So let me go through very quickly. When we started the process about 2 years ago, we have a lot of things in place, a good foundation, I must tell you. We had the climate change policy, as Dr. Jayatunga said, it was in place. And we had the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, the Green Lanka Action Plan, which is one of the key programs that was developed by the National Council for Sustainable Development, which is under the Presidential Secretariat and chaired by His Excellency the President. And we also had, more importantly, a climate change secretariat established by that time. It was established in 2008. And also, we had the involvement and support of 2 national experts committees, one representing the climate change adaptation, which I'm chairing. And also there is a committee on climate change mitigation, though they were not directly involved in development of national adaptation plans, but there were continuous dialogue among members of those 2 committees. And more importantly, once again, there's an interministerial coordinating committee that has been established by the Ministry of Environment, bringing in all relevant parties from different ministries in Sri Lanka, and also trying to get their involvement, ensure that their inputs are being taken in all segments and process that we have conducted right throughout. So those were the basics that we had with us. There was a strong foundation, and we had all the necessary equipment, necessary tools in place for us to start and go through a long journey of development of the National Adaptation Plan, which actually we started about 2.5 years ago, Dr. Jatunga, if I'm not mistaken. And also we had other documentation with us for references. We had 2 national communications done by Sri Lanka. As Dr. Jayatunga said, the technology needs assessment was there. And there was a public perception survey done on climate change in 2010. And we also had sector vulnerability profiles done in 2010 with the assistance of finances coming from Asian Development Bank, which actually led to the development of the National Adaptation Strategy even before the National Climate Change Policy was launched in our country. And we also had the country vulnerability assessment, which was done in 2013, thanks to the UNDP for financial and the technical assistance given in this regard. We moved along, ladies and gentlemen. These were the documentation that were with us. The final map in front of you is the one that was developed by Sri Lankan scientists, identifying the most vulnerable areas in Sri Lanka, especially in relation to agriculture and water, because we consider those are the important aspects, important information in front of us in order to get the National Adaptation Planning done. When we started the process, though there were 2 national expert committees, we thought of outsourcing the overall activity so that the members in the national expert committees will also be in the audience providing inputs and also expressing their views regarding this whole process, which worked out very well, I must tell you. So we had a consultancy being given to a well-known personality in Sri Lanka who started identifying a gap identification process at the very beginning, where we identified the information gaps, technology gaps, policy and governance gaps, institutional gaps, and resource mobilization gaps, and so on. Then thereafter, we developed some major activities, planned for some major activities, and we had the assistance of CANSA, thanks to Ms. Vasita Vijayanayaka, who is here, which was a capacity building workshop. And we had a planning stage activities at the beginning. We analyzed the current and future climate scenarios and so on. I'm not going to go into detail about all these things. And then Sri Lanka started its NAPS process. Once again, I must let you know, we got the assistance from UNFCCC as well for bringing them into Sri Lanka and also educating the hierarchy of the Ministry of Environment and all those ministries who are directly or indirectly concerned with climate change activities in Sri Lanka. So we built awareness right on the top at the very beginning so that we would be in a position to move along very smoothly with respect to the National Adaptation Planning, because we know that's a country-driven process. It's our own process. We own it. And in order to do that, we have to have the assistance. We have to have the blessings of all relevant government ministries if we have to make it relevant and we have to make it practically implementable in the future. So because of that, from square one, we thought of having those people on board. These are the objectives of the NAP process, which are pretty general when you look at all the countries. So I'm not going to harp on this. Anyone who wants to know about those things in detail, I will leave the presentation here. And we also understood when we started developing the NAPs that it's a rolling plan. It's not static. We will be periodically ensuring that whether the things are in order, whether we are on the right track. For example, once the plan was developed for the period 2016 to 2025, we have decided that by 2018, 3 years after the development of the NAPs, we'll have another review, initial review, to see what went wrong at the beginning, whether we have achieved the short-term targets or whether we have to streamline it further and bring the whole process into the correct track For example, if we want to move along according to the plan and achieve our targets by 2025, we may do certain amendments, do certain modification, but definitely for the benefit of our own country people, for the country Sri Lanka. And we were always guided by the national climate change policy that we had, and we also ensured that we had a national climate change adaptation strategy, which was effective from 2011 to 2016, and we used those as base to build upon those things and to decide on what type of future action plans that we are going to have. And mind you, ladies and gentlemen, the plan that we develop is a strategic plan. But when you go into real action, there are certain hurdles that we have to clear, which I will explain in a while. So we had these goals, objectives, and goals and objectives set very clearly based on the information that we had. We had our scope was set in a given manner. We looked at the national level planning. That is the one that we did. And when the national level planning was done, we took the sectoral planning issues into consideration and also had the regional planning issues in mind, though we did not incorporate them directly at the very beginning because it's a process. We have just completed the first part, the most important part of the process, but there's always a continuation that we have to move along. In the sectoral planning, these are the 10 sectors that we considered at the national level adaptation planning, starting from food security, which includes agriculture, livestock, and fisheries. In the morning, we had a big argument with the fisheries in agriculture, because for European Union, it seems that fisheries is a different sector. But here, this is how we look at it, the overall process in terms of food security, health, water resources, blah, blah, blah. And then we also kept in store about the regional planning issues, as I told you a little while ago, because that is going to be our next step, where we have done the main part of it. And when we look at the national planning process, we also looked at the programmatic areas based on those 10 thrust areas that I listed a little while ago. We look at the policy, legal, and governing issues, institutional development and coordination, which is pretty much important when you try to implement this national adaptation planning. Planning is an easy process, I must tell you. You'll be knowing it is easier said than done when you try to implement it at the real ground level. So we wanted to have everything in place, at least in the written format in our documentation, so that implementation is not going to be a Herculean task for us at the end. When I say us, it's actually the Ministry of Environment. So we embarked on a methodology by going through a stepwise systematic process, looking at review of available information, focusing more on the Sri Lankan context, looking at the collecting and collating all the information based on climate change research done in Sri Lanka. That was the starting point. And we have initial brainstorming sessions, then preparation of detailed outline, and was presented to the National Expert Committee on Climate Change Adaptation to get their views, get their concurrence to see whether the consultant is on the correct track based on the TOR given and based on the liking of the Minister of Environment and need of the country. And there were several consultative workshops where a lot of stakeholders covering different strata, different organizations, and different levels were involved in, and that's the best part of it. Still, there were a lot of gaps in this whole process, but I'm sure in the process, in due course, we'll definitely be in a position to rectify most of the things while the plan is being implemented, because we are still welcoming more ideas, because as I told you, it's a rolling plan, it's a development plan which will move, it's not static. We want to upgrade it for the benefit of the country. And finally, the final plan was prepared, and these are the lots of pluses that we had with respect to the whole process. As I told you a little while ago, we had more than 240 participants getting involved in the development of this national adaptation plan, covering 9 sectors, as I presented to you a little while ago, including the cross-cutting center. So there was a very, very broad stakeholder consultation. We are the state organizations, academia, scientists, CSOs, private sector, you just name it, we have it, kind of a thing. And there was an active participation in all the workshops that we organized on behalf of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Secretariat to get this national plan done, national adaptation plan done. And we had a national level focus mainly, but as I told you, we have a task in front of us although we consider the regional level focus, ladies and gentlemen, our country has three main administrative setups. There's a national government, we have the provincial councils, and we have the local governments. In terms of implementation, we have to have the blessings and support of the provincial councils and the local government. So as I told you, there's a task ahead among all of us in front of Dr. Jatunga, myself, my team, as well as the Minister of Environment as a whole, and for all Sri Lankans on the other hand, to ensure that we develop and extend this plan to ensure that at the regional level, for example, at the provincial council level and at the local government level, it is going to be an implementable action plan based on the strategic plan that we have already developed. So this is the way forward in front of us. As I told you, we have to look into provincial and local government level, get their blessings and develop the provincial action plans. I must also let you know that at this present moment, one provincial council has already developed a provincial climate change adaptation plan, and which they produced it under the condition that once a national adaptation plan has been released and launched, they will align the activities in their provincial adaptation plans based on the national adaptation plan. Because we cannot, as a country, go in different directions. We have to align with the national adaptation plans and to the global action networks that we have. We have to identify the financial resources. I know Dr. Jatung even a little while ago was in consultation with donor agencies in order to secure finances to move along with this activity. One crucial thing that we have to achieve is the capacity building, create awareness and build capacity of people who will be getting involved in implementing the national as well as the provincial adaptation plans. This is a very crucial issue for us. We know it is the most important aspect, but we'll definitely embark on it. And then strengthen the existing coordinating mechanisms. We have a national coordinating mechanism in place. We will be using it to the maximum possible extent, to the best possible efficiency that we can achieve, and wherever possible, there will be new coordinating mechanisms being established as well. Our national adaptation plan very clearly specify what sort of coordinating mechanisms that we are going to have at the national level, at the provincial level, as well as at the local government level. Finally, the issues in front of us, we foresee all these things going to happen. We have to face the situation. We have to clear these hurdles. Definitely, we know we have the capacity, but we'll move along with these things. At the beginning, we had a very low stakeholder participation for some workshop in some thematic areas. We got them on board at a later stage, but we have to continue to have them to support us in our activities. And we are a very diverse country in terms of human beings, in terms of culture, religion, and on top of that, we have 46 agroecological regions. That itself shows how diverse the country is. When you say 46 agroecological regions, the rainfall intensity is different, the elevation is different, the temperature is different, the land use is different, and the vegetation is different. That is the biggest challenge in front of us in try to introduce and implement the national adaptation plan. And our administrative setup cut across all these levels, making it much more complex. I'm not trying to say we'll try to be so specific to each and every agroecological region, but we have 3 climatic zones, 7 agroclimatic zones, and then 46 agroecological regions. So we will start with the 3 climatic zone, expanding it further to 7, and then look at the 46 agroecological zones at the end, because we don't want to have all these complexities at the very beginning when you try to implement this particular program, this national adaptation plan. We need for local level planning, as I told you, we need the involvement of farmers, our ground level staff, to get them on board to do this planning and implementation. And one of the drawbacks we had in the system, though we extend a warm invitation to private sector, there was very limited participation on the private sector. The National Expert Committee on Climate Change Adaptation has organized, has initiated a dialogue. We have to get their participation, especially in terms of implementation and partnership, as well as financing, because we know that is the way forward if you want to have a more sustainable program without trying to rely on government coffins. So those are the things that are extremely important at the present status. And we have got the commitment of Ministry of Finance and the Department of National Planning to the outcomes of the National Adaptation Plan. And that is a strength to us, especially in attracting foreign funds as well, in moving along to develop, to strengthen this plan further and ensure it's practically implementable. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Professor Marabe. Now I would like to take questions for both Dr. Jayatung and Professor Marabe, if you have questions for them. I hope there's a mic that we can pass around. Yes. Who would like to ask questions? Okay. One.
Thanks. Thank you for the presentations. I was just wondering, you mentioned that you're going to do a review in 2018 to see what's gone well, what's gone wrong, what might need to change. I was wondering if you've thought at all about how you're going to go about monitoring progress in the NAP process and its implementation to inform that review.
Thank you for that question. Yes, the National Adaptation Plan very clearly indicates a process that will be involved in monitoring and the review. It's a detailed process, so I just do not want to harp on it at this particular stage, but just to ensure that all those things have been looked after well, and it's been very clearly strategized and been detailed out in the National Adaptation Plans.
Do we have any more questions for them? If not, I could start leading questions. But if you have specific questions, please ask now, or I might take and ask questions. Okay. So since we are waiting for questions from the floor, can I ask a question from both of you? So I think both of you highlighted about how the stakeholder engagement has been there. But could you say the opportunities that are created to encourage stakeholder engagement in National Adaptation Plan as well as other actions on climate change in Sri Lanka?
Okay, let me answer first, but Dr. Jayatung will be the better person to answer that. But still, we initiated dialogues at several levels at the very beginning, but then the responses are a bit lackadaisical, I must tell you, at the initial stages when we wanted to get people on board in the planning process. But of course, we were successful because we had discussions at different levels. We want, through the interministerial coordination committee, we wanted to create awareness and enthusiasm on this whole process, where the responses was very positive, I must tell you. But we have a task ahead of us that's regarding implementation. And that's where we have to strategize it well. And as I told you, we have developed a strategic plan, that's true. But when it comes to implementation, we have to educate the provincial setup and we have to educate the local government setup in order to attract their attention, their participation, and also build enthusiasm to ensure that whatever the plans that we have will be implemented at the ground level. And that is what we are planning right now. There are different mechanisms that will be adopted for that. And of course, we have no concrete decision made that this is the way that we are going to move along with, but the National Expert Committee on Climate Change Adaptation will be advising the Climate Change Secretariat of the Ministry of Environment in due course on the way forward. Because please don't forget that we launched the document on 18th October, just a few weeks ago. A lot of enthusiasm to launch the document first, because we are it's in NAP Central, as Dr. Jayatung quite correctly mentioned. But now the tedious and the Herculean task is implementation, which we have begun planning right now, especially as you told you, to get the stakeholder participation. Dr. Jayatung.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question for impose. Stakeholder consultation. So stakeholder consultation in climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and all those. I just will brief how we are getting the stakeholder consultations for a different aspect of climate change related initiatives in Sri Lanka. Especially we invite private sector and also civil societies and also academia expert and all those. Even as our professor mentioned about the formulation process, how the stakeholder consultation undertook for the NAP preparation process. But for other example, when we developing that INDCs, intended national determined contributions, we were got the consultations or the stakeholder consultations from different strata of the society. And also in the implementation of the NAP is the big challenge for us. So we have established, we have already identified the sectoral cells to implement and coordinate the actions what we have already identified in our NAPs. So there's a challenge, and we have to think of how the other stakeholders like CSOs and private sector as well as academia expert, how they can get on board to implement our NAP. So that's we have to determine in the future. So we have a plan, and without because climate change is affected to all, and all are responsible. So therefore, our thinking is that everybody should be involved on board to implement our NAP. Thank you very much.
I have a second question. Okay, Peter has a question. Yes, Peter.
Thank you, Busita, and thank you for the interesting presentations of this comprehensive adaptation plan. My question is, in the presentation and I'm Peter Witt from CARE Denmark and the Southern Voices Program Coordinator. In your presentation, you mentioned that you had done an analysis of the vulnerability on a sector-based approach, if I recall it right. My question is on in which ways have you tried to address the different vulnerabilities of different people? Because if you go to the community level, then we know all of us that climate change have a different impact regarding to the vulnerability of people. It can be different criteria, it can be ethnic groups, it can be gender considerations, but these are key to support those who are the most vulnerable to address and take action on climate change. So my question is, how have you sort of addressed the social inequality issues as part of the vulnerability analysis? Thank you.
This is a very, very important point. We had a big question mark in front of us. Although I was not directly involved in, the people who were involved in doing the vulnerability assessment had this big question: how are I going to tackle the complexities in our society? How are I going to tackle the social aspect, the biodiversity aspect, and more importantly, the ecological differences that we have? And final decision was that we didn't want to go into such detailed analysis in order to start up the process, because we did not want to get bogged down in such detailed analysis to start the national adaptation planning process. So we went through physical parameters. For example, for agriculture and water, we selected 22 physical parameters and then embarked on doing the vulnerability analysis. As I told you, this is why I always said this is a rolling plan. The information will start flowing in when the time passes by. When people's capacity being built up in terms of science, for example, new analytical tools will come into picture. We incorporate all those things in the future and upgrade and strengthen our national adaptation plan further. So the simple answer is we use simple technologies that is applicable to us so that we could get a basic background with respect to the vulnerabilities that we have. For example, the map that I showed you, that included 22 physical parameters to develop, to decide on the district level vulnerabilities. And now the similar study has been extended to the divisional level. It's much smaller administrative units to look at their vulnerabilities as well. So all that information will be co-opted in the future and will ensure the national adaptation plan will be further strengthened in the future based on the information that flows in. So that's the process that we adopted.
Dr. Jayatungu, would you like to add to it a bit? Or? Okay. So I have one more question, or rather two, but I think we could have the other one as the last question, unless anyone from the floor has a question. Yes.
Hello. My name is Hoàng from Climate Change Working Group, Vietnam. I have two questions for you. The issue you show here in presentation is that the low stakeholder participant in some sectors. So I am just concerned if you have any tactics or any plan to improve that participation. And the question that you mentioned that you have a lot of consultation with stakeholder, but I just concerned do you have the role of the local authority? Do they have engaged in that process, or do they have consulted? Thank you.
Good question once again. I think one thing I must tell you in this whole process, for example, farmers were not directly involved in. I must tell you at this level, because we want to plan at provincial level and the local government level. We want to get them on board, because as I told you, this is a strategic plan. Of course, yes, initially we had a problem. That's exactly what I'm mentioning here. For initial workshops, we had a real influx of personnel from different sectors to show their enthusiasm and strength as well. But on certain sectors, we have very lethargic kind of movement in terms of participation. So it's a continuous dialogue that help us to achieve this goal. We talk to people personally, talk to the institutional heads personally to ensure that their attention and attraction in this process. And we got adequate number of people coming into picture, but still we could not meet the adequate number of private sector participation, very frankly. That was a drawback that we think. So now even the adaptation committee, what we thought was we do not have a private sector representation. So the adaptation committee has recommended, and that recommendation has been forwarded to Dr. Jayatunga, so that when we meet from next time, there will be private sector participation, mainly from chambers, so that the message can get across quickly and on a wider basis, and we can get their support, physical as well as financial, in terms of sustenance of the program that we are trying to implement in the future. So that is why it stands right now. As for the local government thing, we did not invite people as local governments, but people from local governments were involved in. I hope you got the point. We did not invite people as provincial governments, but there were experts in the provincial governments who had contributed to this program. But when you develop the provincial action plan, we'll definitely have the provincial governments in the provincial setup, the provincial departments, as well as other authorities involved in. Same thing will be applicable to the local governments. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Marambe. Would you, Dr. Jayatung, would you like to add to it, or would you like to take?
So some compliments to Professor Marambe's answer. Regarding local authorities participation, as we have many local authorities in Sri Lanka, what we did, we invited the Ministry of Local Councils and Provincial Councils and Local Governments. So that local governments, local authorities represented by the ministry, in addition to some experts we call from the provincial levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just because I have two questions, one's on capacity building, but I'll park it for concluding remarks. That will be for everyone. But for Dr. Jayatunga, could I ask a specific question on what we had in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lanka Next conference? If you could add one, maybe like 30 seconds on outcomes and what you think were successes, because I think we were going to focus on that, but we focused a lot on National Adaptation Plan alone.
So thank you very much. That what we were able to do this Sri Lanka Next Blue Green Era conference and exhibition, which was parallelly conducted with 5th Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum. Actually, what we were able to exchange views, experience, lesson learned, because we conducted several parallel events like research symposiums, talks on different subjects, and also in that sense that we were able to exchange the experience, lesson learned, as well as make the aware even public, because it was some events, some conferences were open for the public. So therefore, the most successful things what I have shared with you, that we were able to share the experiences as well as technical know-how, and also the make aware the public. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Professor Marbe and Dr. Jayatunga, both for your valued input. Now I would like to change a bit the focus to civil society engagement and multi-stakeholder engagement in adaptation planning and national adaptation plans. So the next two speakers are from Southern Voices on Adaptation program, um, which is a group of networks working across 12 countries, 3 continents, and is based on joint principles on adaptation, which is a statement by civil society organizations from across the world on what they consider to be a benchmark for good adaptation planning and implementation. So this is not in disconnect with the two speakers and what they mentioned before, because Southern Voices on Adaptation was engaging actively in the process of the National Adaptation Plan in Sri Lanka. And when Professor Marbe mentioned the inaugural workshop, we were involved in that as well. So this tool is for ensuring that national policies and plans meet the needs and fulfill the rights of the most vulnerable people to adapt to climate change. And this is also considered as one of the supplementary material for the NAP guidelines of the UNFCCC. They were introduced in August 2014 to the supplementary materials, which is found on the UNFCCC website. And these have also been revised multiple times based on evidence on from case studies that were done in countries that we work in. So we have two speakers and 7 principles, and 7 principles are focusing on participation and inclusion, financial integrity, mainstreaming and coordination, local level adaptation, vulnerability and diversity, balanced investment, evidence and information. So the 7 principles have criteria which could be used as a tool to evaluate where your country is at and how it could be improved. And I think the reports and the documents that are available for you have the 7 principles, which would be helpful to understand the next presentations. So our first speaker is Emma from Southern Voices. She's working in Kenya, and she will, well, I'm having a little bit of difficulty because I'm switching from one laptop to the other. No, it's okay. No. She's going to speak without slides, but it's for the introduction. So Miss Emma Boa, I hope I pronounced the name right, is Program and Advocacy Manager for CARE Kenya, and she'll be speaking on how Southern Voices and ALP program is working in Kenya. But you're free to speak about other things as well, because I don't have your presentation. I'm thinking this is.
Um, Thank you, Vosita. So what I'm going to talk about is the NAP development process in Kenya, just briefly, and then bit to the JPAs. Okay, so what I'm going to speak about is the NAP development process in Kenya, highlighting some of the lessons that we have from that process, but also linking it to some of what has happened with the JPAs in Kenya. And I'm going to start from 2010. So in 2010 in Kenya, there was a national climate change strategy. And I think the government and stakeholders began to realize that the strategy was made up of very strong political statements, but not much around implementation. So then there was discussion to think about developing an action plan which could operationalize the strategy. So this action plan had 8 subcomponents, and one of the subcomponents was on adaptation. And originally it was just going to be a subcomponent on adaptation, but then because of all the global discussions around moving from NAPAs to NAPs, then that piece of the action plan is what we currently have as the National Adaptation Plan. So the way it was structured is that for each of the 8 components of the National Climate Change Action Plan, there was a team of experts that was selected at the national level I think in each of the subcomponents, it ranged from about 10 to 20, depending on how widely stakeholders were interested in engaging. And then, so within the NAP process, there was a group of 15 people that were supporting consultants that were hired by the Kenyan government to help to develop the NAP. So in the 15-member group, there was representation from all sorts of stakeholders. So we had some people working at the local level and some working at the national level. There was private sector representation. There was representation from research, from the academia. And I think the government tried as much as they could to have some sort of representation, although it's difficult to say that 15 people represented the entire country. But I think also in terms of managing numbers and moving forward, they settled on the 15. And then there was a chair of the group that was selected, who is a climate change expert, a climate change adaptation expert. And I think that helped to move things forward. Then at the higher, at the national level, there was a task force where each of the chairs of the 8 subcomponents would meet to try and make sure that the NAP was not being done in isolation. It was linked to finance, for example. It was linked to mitigation in some way, to MRVs, just to make sure that it was not a standalone document or process, and it was linked to all the other processes going on in the country. So what happened is that there were regular meetings of the 15, but then one of the criteria for selecting the 15 was that they represented some sort of constituency, so that whoever was on that technical working group could reach a number of people, could represent or get feedback from a certain group of people, whether it be networks or communities or marginalized groups or whichever it was, but the idea was that they could reach a big number of people. And I think the NAP has some good elements in it. There's a good balance of hardware, like tangible things that could actually be implemented, but also has included things like capacity building, mechanisms for making sure that there is access to information and making sure that the information is timely and in a usable manner to different groups of people. And then the NAP also has been done in a way that it allows for flexibility just in case something has changed in the climate, or there's new information coming in, or there's technology that can support to push things forward. So I think it has some really good elements in it that as Kenya we should be proud of. And then in terms of informing the process of developing the NAP, there was no assessment that was done specifically for the NAP. What happened is that different groups were asked to provide any assessments that they had already done. So whether it was on climate vulnerability or capacity or gender assessment, any assessment that was deemed as relevant, stakeholders were invited to provide those reports. And that's basically what was used in that process. Of course, one gap in that is that a lot of those assessment reports were from either projects or programs which were short-term or had ended or targeted a very small part of the country or a very specific group of people. So it was not exactly the most comprehensive. But in the case of Kenya, that is actually what was used to inform the development of the NAPs. And then I think in terms of some of the drivers, some of the elements that led to the success or the good elements in the NAP is that there's very good political will in Kenya. I think we now have a climate change directorate, which was a climate change secretariat that has a group of people that are very open and willing to collaborate and have very strong capacity. The only challenge is that there are very few, but I think we've had good working relationships with them, and they are open to working with all sorts of stakeholders, whether it's NGOs or research or academia, or private sector, they're very open. And then I think generally in Kenya, we have quite a a good amount of capacity in terms of technical capacity on adaptation from all fronts. I think at the national level, the people who are involved in adaptation have years of experience, have very high levels of capacity to engage in the process. The only challenge is that there are also a very small number of people. So it would be good for that capacity to actually trickle down to others. And then I think there's also diversity in the strengths that are available in the country. You have all sorts of people working at the local level, at the community level, at the national level, some who also work beyond the national level. And bringing all those types of people together, I think, was very important in terms of pushing in terms of strengthening the content of the NAP. And then I think that we had endless revision of the NAP in terms of the content, the structure, because there were debates about should it be aligned to the normal development planning cycle, or should we recognize that adaptation won't exactly respect those timelines or the current sectors and try and do different things. And I think there was a bit of playing around with that to try and find some sort of balance to make sure that the NAP would be relevant and would not get stuck in the current sectors in the country. And then I think so I think the fact that it's aligned to the current government planning structures has some merits and demerits. The advantage is that if it came to budgeting, for example, it's much easier to budget for it. It's just that if we are looking for more holistic plans and initiatives on adaptation, then there are limitations because you still have to work within the sectors. But also the good thing is that in the Kenyan, and well, it's still an INDC, in the Kenyan INDC, the adaptation bit of it is literally a copy and paste of the NAP. The NAP is the adaptation arm of the Kenyan INDC. So I think that makes it easier for us so that we have one guiding document in the country and everything links to it. And even now, all the proposals to the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund, any of the institutions that are submitting those proposals have been encouraged to make sure that they're in line with the NAP. It hasn't happened as much as we would like it to happen, but I think the fact that there's that guidance is also something to celebrate. So it's not all rosy, unfortunately. And I think I already mentioned some of the challenges we have in terms of there's good capacity, but it's a very small number of people that actually have that capacity. We have really good vulnerability and capacity assessments that have been done. Again, those are very specific to small groups of people or a very small part of the country. We still have the sector approach. We have problems with coordination. And I think in Kenya, the challenge is actually that there's too much going on. We have climate change units everywhere in government. Almost all ministries have a climate change unit. And then I think there was a very good attempt to try and make it as participatory and make sure that there were multi-stakeholder exchanges in the process. But I think generally it's usually very difficult to actually reach the most vulnerable. So even when you go to a community like a pastoralist community, we will still try and work with the ones who can speak English, the ones who've gone to school a little bit, the ones who have some sort of basis for us to start with so that we can have some quick wins and report back to donors, for example. And I think quite a bit of that also happened in the Kenyan scene. I think the development of the NAP is one of the best examples in the country in terms of trying to get as many people to participate as possible. There was even a deliberate effort to make sure that each of the 47 counties actually got an opportunity 2 times to give input into the NAP, and they clustered some of the areas so that, because they couldn't go to each and every county, so they clustered some of the counties and made sure that at least there was a chance for people to provide input. And then I think one of the other challenges is finance, which I think is a challenge everywhere. And we still have some questions we need to answer in Kenya. So how do we make decisions around finance? How do we determine how to do the allocations? Who should take part in the decision making around that? Who is currently engaged? Who is left out? Who should we make sure that is actually also participating and is being given a voice in the decision making on adaptation finance? And I think this is where the joint principles of adaptation come in very handy, because we've had instances where civil society have used them to have structured discussions with policymakers. We've had situations where there's a gender and climate change network in Kenya, and they work with women farmers, and they use the joint principles of adaptation to support the women to better articulate their issues, so that when they go to sit down with the decision makers, they don't feel as intimidated. They have a bit more confidence to express their views. And we've also had instances where civil society have used the joint principles of adaptation with the national NIE to try and identify gaps in the proposals that were in the Kenyan proposal that was submitted to the adaptation fund. So I think the joint principles for adaptation can come in handy when it comes to implementation of the NAP, especially in also providing civil society with more content, stronger messaging, and even more capacity to engage on issues of adaptation. Oh, and just the last point is that actually, so I was part of the team of the civil society, a group that went to talk to the NIE about using the JPAs to sort of review the Kenyan proposal to the Adaptation Fund. And because of those discussions, we also saw some gaps when it comes to implementation, when it comes to working with practitioners of adaptation. And the JPAs actually inspired us to develop a checklist, which is very targeted to practitioners to sort of help them to try and see how to better strengthen adaptation. So for example, if it's gender, then it tries and encourages the practitioners to go beyond counting women to actually do gender analysis and try and look at how men and women work together, make decisions together, collaborate, and improve their relationships. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I was going to ask you the question on how joint principles were used, but you answered it. So before I go to Alejandro, since it's from 2 countries, maybe I'll open the floor for one question to Emma, and then we can have general questions to both of them addressed. Would someone like to ask a question from Emma? If not, I can keep them for after Alejandro speaks. Okay, no specific questions. Okay, so Alejandro can speak, and then we'll have the general questions afterwards. So Alejandro is Alejandro Alman. I keep calling you Alejandro, but others don't know. He's a regional facilitator for Latin America for Southern Voices on Adaptation, and he's based in Nicaragua. He'll be speaking on his experiences working with civil societies and other actors using the joint principles on adaptation. So you could use this. Yeah, up, you can use this.
Thank you very much to all of us for coming to our side event on the joint principles, to the side event where we are talking on the joint principles on adaptation, and thanks to the government of Sri Lanka to give us this important space also to talk on these important issues for civil society in Central America. And just, I will begin saying that Central America is one of the most vulnerable regions around the world to the impacts of climate change. And civil society networks from Central America has been trying to put the aspect of such vulnerability in the agenda of this international forum so that the countries from Central America can receive the same treatment in the access to financial resources and in the access to capacity building and so on than the most vulnerable countries like small islands, less developed countries, etc. Despite we are not classified in those groups of countries. We have certain vulnerabilities, certain particularities that made us as vulnerable as countries being classified as highly vulnerable. For example, on last year's Central America has been affected by drought, which has put in danger the viability of the livelihoods of people living mainly in the dry corridor of Central America. And in this sense, tools like the Joint Principles for Adaptation has been very important tools for civil society sectors to advocate in favor of policies and actions that promote and respect the rights of the most vulnerable sectors from the region. Yeah. As it has been mentioned here, has been mentioned by Bosita, the Joint Principles for Adaptation were initially seen as a tool that may help to influence national policies on adaptation, mainly the NAP process. And it was a process that spent revision from different sectors. We have had at least 3 revisions of the Joint Principle for Adaptations, and we have developed also spaces of dialogue with governments in the region from Central America, in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, in order to put in the agenda of the government the main aspects of the Joint Principles for Adaptation and to present the Joint Principles for Adaptation as a tool that can help us to improve the NAP process. This time, I will talk on Nicaragua and Guatemala. We can pass on the experience of Guatemala and Nicaragua, and just to tell you that the way that we have used the Joint Principles for Adaptation is not the way that we initially planned. We have found so many aspects around the Joint Principle for Adaptation. For example, in the case of Guatemala, our partner there is the Indigenous Roundtable on Climate Change, and the Indigenous Roundtable on Climate Change, if it is true that they have been working on the process of incidence on the National Adaptation Plan from Guatemala, but they have also found so that Joint Principles for Adaptation are also useful for other purposes. Guatemala is currently promoting the reglementation process of a national law on climate change, and Joint Principle for Adaptation in the case of Guatemala has been used by the Indigenous Roundtable on Climate Change to put in the agenda of the legislators the aspects associated to the rights of indigenous peoples in Guatemala. There are at least 3 joint principles for adaptations that are directly linked to the rights of indigenous peoples, and so that we have identified opportunities on the process of reglementation of the national law to put it in the agenda of the stakeholders, of the parliamentarians in the case of Guatemala, to promote the approbation or the implementation of a law that will respect the rights of indigenous peoples. And also, of course, that this law is strongly linked to the national adaptation process. Joint Principles for Adaptations in Guatemala, as well as in other countries from Central America, has been also useful for social scrutiny. we have in Guatemala used the joint principle for adaptations to make a revision on national policies, to compare national policies with local policies, and to see if they may click the coincidence of the national and local policies and what is happening. And there have been important results of those exercises being developed by civil society. In the screen, you have some result that that says that, for example, it was demonstrated that there were frequent disconnection between a national level, municipal level, and local level while applying the joint principle for adaptation as a scrutiny tool to the different policy instruments in Guatemala. For example, while national law promotes the access to information for the municipalities, in many cases, possibly not in all cases, in the area of Guatemala where we are working, which is the area of Chiquimula, some municipalities don't make the public the plans, and also they don't make the communities don't realize about their existence. The issue that we have the joint principle for adaptation as a tool for this scrutiny has made that the communities as well as municipalities realize on some aspects to improve, to improve or to make better the policy and the plans on adaptations. In the case of Nicaragua, we work, our national partners is the National Alliance on Climate Change, and we have used the joint principles for adaptations to promote the approbation of a national law on climate change. To date, Nicaragua and El Salvador are the two countries from Central America that doesn't have a national law on climate change. And in both cases, we believe that the national law on climate change is needed so that it gives the political or the institutional background to national policies, especially national plans on adaptation. On that regard, we have presented the joint principle for adaptation to national legislators that belong to the Commission on Environment from the National Parliamentarian. And we have seen that the joint principles for adaptations may provide a good guide to develop a national proposal on law on climate change, as well as a national plan, a national adaptation plan that respect the rights of the people, of the most vulnerable peoples from the country, especially the people living in the dry corridor, which has been severely affected by drought in the last years and where livelihoods will be in danger, possibly in the next years, as well as the rights of indigenous peoples living in the Atlantic coast. Joint principle for adaptations has been also used as scrutiny to make scrutiny to local adaptation plans. They have helped municipalities, subnational governments, as well as local communities to realize on the need of strengthening the participation of the people, on the need of improving so many areas where the processes of adaptation need to be improved. So in Central America, in our case, we have incorporated the joint principle for adaptations in some different initiatives. Currently, the Sustainability Watch Network and Centro Humboldt have at least 5 regional projects that promote the joint principles for adaptation as a scrutiny tool in the 4 countries in this area that we call CA4, which are the countries from Central America more affected by climate change. And there has been also other organizations working in the area that has adopted the joint principle for adaptation as a lobby, as a tool to lobby in order to improve the quality of the national plans and other policies related to climate change. In this sense, why they has been so widely adopted in Central America, and why the joint principles for adaptation are today recognized by most civil society sector as an important tool to make the social scrutiny, is because we need new tools that can help CSO and municipal governments to measure and monitor the implementation of local adaptation plans. For the civil society, there is also the need of ensuring participation and accountability. In this country, the GPA are the GPA are a good social audit tool. We have been used the joint principles for adaptation to evaluate national and local policy instruments, to see how the implementation of advocacy plans by authorities are going, and to provide support and strengthen capacity of government and local officials and authorities. And so I believe that the tool in our context still will be suffering changes. We are still adapting the joint principle for adaptation to specific circumstances on Central America. We have but with many differences. So the joint principle for adaptation is a good base to start making social scrutiny on all this process. In the case of Nicaragua, we will start a dialogue process with the government in order to see, now we have a methodology to develop the National Adaptation Plan, which is based on the joint principle for adaptation. And we will present the methodology in the forthcoming days to the government, so that in the case of Nicaragua, the National Plan on Adaptation has expired. It expired this year, and even most national policies on climate change has already expired. So possibly this tool can be more adapted to our needs. We have learned a lot on the processes of social scrutiny, but it will be so important to strengthen the participation of civil society, mainly in three levels, in local, municipal, and national level.
Thank you, Alejandro. We'll take one specific question for Alejandro and then maybe one general question for both of them. Do you have any specific questions for Alejandro? Anyone who has specific questions for him? Okay, so general questions for both Alejandro and Emma. If not, I can ask a general question for all of you, because I think something that has been repeatedly said in different forms is about capacity building. So I'll first address it to Emma and Alejandro. You've got 1.5 minutes maximum to answer the question, just to keep to time. So what do you think were the capacity needs? Because I heard that there is capacity, then it's few. How do we address this? Or if there is no capacity, how do we address this? And in what sort of challenging situations, what kind of capacities is missing, and what do you think are the solutions? That's a general question for both of you, and then I'll come to both of you as well.
Okay, so if I have 1.5 minutes, I won't list the capacity needs, but what I'll say is, what I think is part of the challenge is that we normally, the practice is to do a capacity needs assessment, then do one capacity building session and then stop there. But I think there's a need to realize that capacity building doesn't really stop. The need for capacity building is more long-term. So what if, for example, there's capacity building for farmers, for example, and we are just coming from a drought, and then 2 seasons from now we get floods, then the needs are very different. So recognizing that the needs also are dynamic and change, and we need to realize that as things are changing, we need to constantly try and strengthen our capacity, and it doesn't have to be workshops. There are many forms that it can be done. Would be something is something that is important to recognize.
Thank you, Emma.
Yes, there are so many challenges in terms of capacity buildings in Central America. First of all, we still have to understand the impacts of climate change in all livelihoods, in all the sectors from Central America. We now have a very small understanding on the impact of climate change in the medium term on the main crops that which the food rely, which the security food relies, and we need to create more clear scenarios. Scenarios that we have now are in a too big scale. We need to bring those scenarios to local level so that we can have a better understanding on the performance of the future climate over and its impact over the livelihoods of the people living mainly in rural areas. And then once we have that understanding, we need to incorporate adequate measures in the programs of agriculture, in the extension programs of agriculture. We need to recover the extension programs of agriculture so that since about 20 years ago, they has been disappeared. So in the new context where climate change has increasing impact, especially in the area of food security, we will need to recover those programs and to create those capacities that permit us to understand better what will be the impact of future scenarios over those crops that the food security of the people living there will rely on. And now we are having displacement of people because of livelihoods in so many areas of Central America just are not viable anymore. Patterns of the weather have changed. The crops doesn't get adapted there is no enough time so that our crops can be adapted to the new patterns in the climate. So we need a lot of research, a lot of understanding, and so many aspects related to the future scenario of climate that we will need to strengthen in Central America. So the issue of capacity building will be really important. And just to end, the aspects of financing, the decisions on finance for adaptations that are taken here in this international process will be very important for us in Central America so that our governments won't have the capacity to deal with all those impacts by themselves. We have urgent needs in terms of education, housing, infrastructure, etc. So more investments in area of climate change will be needed. So financing will be very important.
Okay, thank you, Alejandro. Peter has a question. We have 5 more minutes. So should I park your comments as final comments? And maybe you could link up the capacity building to the concluding comments. And I'll just give the mic to Peter.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the presentation from civil society also. My question is for all of you, and it's related to linking the experience we have shared now on what you have been doing at government level and at civil society level to promote adaptation policies at the national level. Now, since you started all this work, we had the Paris Agreement last year, and we have the decision on the global goal of adaptation and the Article 7 with all the principles. Then my question is, in 2 years' time, we will have a global stocktake. And adaptation is part of a stocktake. So we will have a kind of discussion around in this forum of the Climate Convention on what is the elements which are important from developing countries to report back, to communicate back in the adaptation communication as part of the stocktake. So my question to you is, what are the key elements? Of course, it's a long question and it's only to start the debate, but I'm curious to learn what comes up to your mind first as the most important for you to communicate back, to share with the other parties in the UNFCCC in the stocktake on adaptation.
Okay, in the interest of time, not to go beyond the next 4 minutes, but I'm going to rephrase that question. I'm going to ask everyone to say one element that you think is very important when it comes to adaptation communication so that we will not exceed the time. So I'll start with Emma, and I'll get the 2 concluding comments from the 2 speakers from the comment.
So I would say maybe a focus on decision making, how decisions are made, whether it's in plans or in budgets, who is involved, um, what effort has been made to make sure that there is more representation, what mechanisms are there, what resources are there. But at the end of the day, maybe the one thing that I would like to see talked about a little bit more is in terms of decision making for adaptation and who is involved in that.
So in one word, maybe the process, adaptation decision process, maybe? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Alejandro, one word.
Okay, thank you. I think that if we have something to communicate on terms of adaptation, it should be related with food security of the people. There are so many indicators that we may develop on adaptation. Nevertheless, it's a very difficult question. What to report on adaptation is a very broad area. What comes to my mind is the aspect of
Sorry, before you answer that question, maybe you could add the concluding remarks to that also.
Okay, that for the global stock take that will take place in 2018. For the adaptation communication, I think it should be included the need of finance for the adaptation, need of the capacity building needs, and also that the technology needs should be incorporated into this adaptation communication to this global stock take. For concluding remarks, I take this opportunity to thank actually for the Southern Voices and the Humboldt from Nicaragua for organizing or the take partnership with us to share the experience between uh, uh, the civil societies and the government experience on national adaptation planning. So that I think we need to take hands with the civil society and also private sector and also all the strata of the society, including governments and the scientific community, to build the resilience of the uh, communities, resilience of the vulnerable communities to meet the adverse effect of climate change in terms of climate change adaptation.
So Professor Marube says that he's going to repeat the same thing as Alejandro because his keen interest is in agriculture. And thank you very much, everyone, for the wonderful presentations, and thank you for attending the side event. I will conclude the side event on time, so you can go and have your dinner. Thank you very much.